Thank you. I guess do a share screen.
Yeah, you should be able to do share screen, yes.
All righty. Hope everyone can see this.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, again, thank you for the opportunity this evening. It's time to talk about the Norwegian merchant fleet in World War II and also my father's role in it. My father's name is Per Eskeland. And a recap of the last presentation, really short, was he served on 5 different ships during the war, starting off as a galley boy and then moving all the way up to being a light sailor. 3 of the ships that he served on were sunk at some point in the war after he signed off those ships. One ship almost sunk in a bad weather storm off the coast of Greenland. And the last one was subjected to a bombing raid, incidentally, as the Germans were trying to bomb the Isle of Wight. In mid-1942, he decided to formally join the Norwegian Navy and be a full-time gunner and lead a gun team. But while he was in training in Camp Norway in Nova Scotia, he got very severe pneumonia, and he was ultimately deemed fit for sea duty anymore. And then he still decided to help Norwegian war sailors in some capacity by working at the Norwegian Public Health Service in New York City. But let's just set the stage a little bit. In terms of Norway's merchant fleet, as you may know, it was the 4th largest in the world. I think the Norwegian government likes to go around saying it was the 3rd largest ocean-going merchant fleet in the world, because the United States divided its merchant fleet between ocean-going and those that served in the Great Lakes. But be that as it may, it was a very large merchant fleet, relatively speaking. But in preparation for the war, the Norwegian War Insurance Ships Mutual Association was revived in 1939 to provide for war risk insurance.
That's better.
After Germany's invasion of Poland in September of 1939, the Insurance Fund and the Norwegian government ordered all Norwegian ships to seek Norwegian or neutral ports and await further orders. So that set the stage for the Norwegian government to get involved more deeply in the affairs of Norwegian ship owners. In that time, or within a couple of months, the Norwegian ship owners informally initialed a scheme agreement with the British that put 150 oil tankers at the disposal of Great Britain. This was on top of the 450,000 GRTs as already chartered to the British. Thus, at the outset of World War II, 40% of the Norwegian merchant fleet was already available for use by the Allies. But despite Norway's neutrality, its merchant fleet was not immune to attack by the Axis forces. Norway lost about 55 merchant ships and about 400 seamen. So I have one example on the side. My father did not serve on this ship, but it just illustrates what happened. Here is a tanker that was sailing from Aruba. That was a Dutch colony The Netherlands was neutral. Sailing to Denmark, that was neutral also. It was off the coast of Scotland, and it got sunk, and 5 lives were lost out of the 39 crew. So when Germany invaded Norway, the Norwegian government was on the run, and they made a decision on April 22nd to requisition all Norwegian merchant ships and place them under an organization called Nortraship, or the Norwegian Shipping and Trade Mission. And it was going to be headquartered in London. This was a delicate balancing act that they had to do because Great Britain confiscated all Danish merchant ships. And Norway wanted to avoid that same fate. So they came up with this compromise where the government in exile would kind of run Nortraship. So shortly after the invasion, the British provisionally assumed the responsibility of all the insurance of the Norwegian ships and cargo. Eventually, Nortraship was able to find other sources for the insurance. But then there was an issue that came up about what quote unquote free ships sailing primarily from American harbors to other ports around the world. Well, this generated hard currency for Nortraship, but the British wanted more ships to supply them. So in October 1941, an agreement was reached in which now the British chartered 75% of all Norwegian merchant vessels. But as the war progressed, eventually all free Norwegian merchant ships were chartered either by the British or the Americans. So by early 1944, Nortraship had 52 branch offices affiliated either with New York or with London. And they all had about over 500 employees. And Nortraship generated about 90% of the revenue for the Norwegian government in exile over a 5-year period. So, but eventually, when the war ended, Nortraship returned all the Norwegian merchant ships back to their original owners in September of 1945. So there, I don't want to dwell too much on this. I'll just, because the creation of Nortraship was a great example of cooperation among the private and the public sector, and a delicate balancing act between the Norwegian government in exile and other allied governments. But still, there was division over the ship owners about which ships should be in these free ships and which should be on the Atlantic convoy run. There was divisions between the London office and the New York offices, particularly about servicing American ports. There was also division among the allied governments, both the British and also the Norwegian government in exile, in micromanaging Nortraship. And one example of this is what I consider to be pay envy. I guess in June 1940, Great Britain, I guess, didn't appreciate the fact that the Norwegian seamen were paid more than their British seamen. So there was some compromise reached in which the Norwegian seamen would get a reduction in pay, but then the extra pay would be put in some sort of special account that was going to be used for them after the war. But then the Norwegian government didn't use that money exactly as initially promised, and they used it to support the widows and orphans of deceased or ill seamen. But then in 1972, the Norwegian government rectified the issue and awarded approximately what we consider today to be about $114 million to the war sailors and their surviving relatives. There were crewing problems in late 1940 in regards to the pay decision above, and then all the large losses. Some Norwegian seamen are taking land-based work in the United States or changed to non-Norwegian ships sailing in less dangerous areas. And there was a result of shortage of seamen for Nortraship. So, but this issue was rectified By late 1942, it's higher wages. And then there was a general problem of the tankers, clean versus dirty oil. Notre ship wanted to carry as much dirty oil as possible because clean oil or refined oil deteriorated the ships faster. So there was debate between the Brits and the Norwegians on that. And also the tankers were tasked to carry more cargo than they were initially designed to carry. So they would put tanks and trucks and stuff on top of the oil deck. So another issue came up with the Norwegian government asking all the ships to turn to friendly Allied ports. Is you had all this whaling crew coming back from their season, and they couldn't go back to Norway. So they were sent eventually to Halifax, but you got all these seamen there with nothing to do. So Notre ship and the Norwegian government decided to establish Camp Norway in Lunde, Nova Scotia. And the first sailors were put up in very Spartan accommodations in an indoor curling rink in September of 1940, and then they began to construct. So it was finally completed in kind of record time at the end of November of 1940 and stayed operational until June 25th, 1943, when the Gunnery training mission was transferred to Travers Island in New York. But even that mission ended in October of 1944 as there was sufficient number of gunners on merchant ships by that time. But Camp Norway trained just a little bit under 1,000 Norwegians to serve as gunners to protect merchant ships. Now, what you'll see here, these are photos that I've taken from a book that was distributed to all those who found their way in Camp Norway. So it's from the Camp Norway Foundation, and a lot of the information and photos are from this book, including this photo here of the opening ceremony. So here's a photo of the construction crew that built the Camp Norway, and it looks like a good bunch of guys, don't you think? And another mission that they had was retrofitting some ships. So some of the larger merchant ships, like my father served on, many of them were retrofitted in naval shipyards. Like the one my father was on was, the guns were added at a Canadian Navy base in Vancouver. But you had these smaller ships, these are whale catchers that were, that could get into some of the smaller ports in Nova Scotia, and they got retrofitted. So they became patrol vessels or submarine, used in anti-submarine warfare. And many of them were guarding like the Canadian coast, or a couple of them found their way to Iceland. But one ship was used to train the gunners at Camp Norway. So there were a total of about 100 whale catchers, 8 factory ships, and 5 sealing vessels that found their way to Nova Scotia in 1940. They were, some of them, as I mentioned, were converted to patrol ships or minesweepers, but some of the factory ships were converted to carry cargo. But then there was a decision to send 4 more of these factory ships and their accompanying whaling catchers out for 1 more whaling season. But 3 of those vessels were captured by German raiders in between South Africa and Antarctica in January of 1941. Some of the sealing vessels were also retrofitted as freighters, and they carried supplies to our Allied forces serving way up in the Arctic North. So this was some of the gunnery training that took place at Camp Norway. The larger guns at the bottom, and then they had these anti-aircraft guns. And the picture that's on the upper left is a group of sailors looking at, assembling and disassembling a weapon. So this is a picture of the first group of men to graduate from the Navy Gunnery School at Camp Norway on September 15th, 1940. So it looks like a good group of men. And these are some casual moments at Camp Norway. So see some of the men eating the food, and the cooks and stewards from the whaling fleet were the ones that were assigned to be cooks and servers at Camp Norway. They had a great cooperation with the local Canadians there. And so the picture on the far right is, I guess, a Christmas Eve celebration that they had. And then at the bottom, I think every Sunday morning, the seamen marched to the local Lutheran church for church services.
Of course, they'd be Lutherans.
Yep.
Norwegian Lutheran.
So during the time in Camp Norway, the Crown Prince and the Crown Princess visited a couple of times. So again, these are photos from the book. I guess a more formal celebration that took place in the major hotel in Halifax. The picture at the bottom left is the Crown Prince and the Crown Princess visiting Camp Norway in February of 1941.
Phil, maybe you could ask
Yeah.
people to mute their phone, mute
Yeah,
their
please,
video.
yeah, please mute your thing, especially if you're coughing or have dogs in the house.
Thank you. And then the bottom right photo is the Crown Prince and Crown Princess visiting a converted whale catcher. So they're greeting the sailors and the officers there. So my father had the privilege of them visiting his ship on March 8th, 1942. They were there for a morale boosting mission because 2 days before, a convoy had left Halifax, and it was under severe attack, and several ships were sunk, including 2 Norwegian vessels. My father said one was an oil tanker and one was a cargo ship. And he had an encounter with the second mate of the oil tanker, who had both his legs amputated, and he related his story about how he had to survive by going under the water because the top of the water was covered in oil and it was on fire. So that was seared in my father's memory too. But I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that there was a Norwegian Army presence also right near Camp Norway. These were overseas Norwegians, basically based in America or Canada, that volunteered. They wanted to do something. So they came here to Camp Norway to get trained starting in late 1941. But by May of 1943, most of them were eventually transferred to Great Britain as the operations at Camp Norway started to wind down, because the main mission, the Navy Gunnery training mission, was being transferred to New York. So here's some pictures of the entrance to Camp Norway, I guess back in the early 40s, and then what it looks like today on the right. Not much left. Everything was torn down. Only the sign remains. And then there's a little memorial stone that I'll show later in between those 2 shrubs. There's a Camp Norway exhibit at a nearby museum, the Fisheries Museum of the Atlantic, in which they show many of the same photos that I've showed you here, and letters and newspaper articles. And one former sailor donated his uniform. So if you're ever up in that neck of the woods, I'd encourage you to take a visit. Each person who passed through Camp Norway, as the best that the Camp Norway Foundation can identify, they get this little pin, which is was in my father's possession. So this is a photo of King's Hill. So initially, when all these Norwegian seamen came, the Norwegian Health Service established a medical center in downtown Halifax, but it was soon overwhelmed with seamen who had more serious injuries or sicknesses and needed long-term rehabilitation. So the Norwegian government purchased a former hotel, and it served as a hospital and convalescence center. And it could support 153 patients. Kings Hill was almost immediately fully occupied upon opening in August of 1941, and it was a place where actually my father was for several months as he recuperated from pneumonia. Also, the Norwegian Skippers Association purchased a large house nearby to serve as a recreation center and short-term residence for officers while they were waiting new assignments. To give you a perspective, I think Chester is about 25 miles, a little bit south of Halifax. So eventually the gunnery training mission was transferred to Travers Island, which is in the Bronx, New York. And so I came across this program, 17th of May program from 1944 that looks like my father attended, and almost all of it's in Norwegian. But at the end, there was a little a plug for how to donate to help injured Navy personnel or their families, members of seamen who are deceased. And in that, there was a postcard you see on the far left. This was a postcard printed by Help American Friends of Norway. And you could see a profile of or shadow of a German soldier overwhelming, I guess, a Norwegian mother and her two children looking heavenward for help. So I came across some interesting photos of the open house at Travers Island. These are housed at the Library of Congress. So it's someone from the War Information Office took all these photographs. So I don't have all of them, but I thought they were highlighted some of the more interesting ones. So on the top left, you see two seamen having a little coffee, and then a Norwegian girl is lighting candles in honor of everyone's sacrifice. Next to it is a seaman showing a civilian how to look through, I guess, a gun sight. To the left of that is a group of Norwegian athletes marching onto the field. Most of the day on this open house was athletic competitions. But I thought the bottom photo was the most interesting. It has the Norwegian Consulate General seated next to the commander of the gunnery school. And if you notice, the Consul General is a female. And looking at this, I don't think it's the wife of the Consul General, because the person that you can't see next looks like another naval officer. So someone in a military uniform. So if she wasn't the Consul General, most likely the gentleman next to her might have been in civilian clothes. Anyway, I thought that was interesting. And then here are some photos from the athletic events that took place. So they combined a few Norwegian or European activities along with American. So you see soccer and track and field and tug of war, but then there's also a potato sack race and look like an egg race, holding a egg in a spoon and running across the field in the bottom left photo. Then there's a series of photos from the 17th of May parade in 1944. This may be one of the few where there's a heavy military presence in the 17th of May parade. We always know that it's kind of the children's parade, but this was kind of interesting to see this. And I think it's helpful to remember that in the 1930s, there were about 63,000 persons of Norwegian descent living in Brooklyn. So some people called it a suburb of Oslo or Bergen. Because it was the third largest Norwegian city in the world, so to speak. So what you have here is, we'll go clockwise from the top left. So you see like young Norwegian American parade watchers. You see one pilot from the Royal Norwegian Air Force. Part of his face and body is cut off, but he's followed by a group of shipmates from the Norwegian Merchant Marine. At the bottom corner is dignitaries on the reviewing stand. You have a Rear Admiral from the US Navy there saluting, but I thought what was interesting from a personal perspective is the gentleman who's second from the right. His name is Dr. Leon, and he eventually became my father's boss at the Norwegian Public Health Service when he started working there in July 1944. Going down, see Norwegian American Red Cross workers, and then there's a huge crowd. And I increased the size to see what corner this was, and it was 4th Avenue and 66th Street. So many of you who may be like me, who originally grew up in the New York City metropolitan area, who remember all these 17th of May parades and all the variations of the routes. And I just thought it was interesting to note in 1944, it was at one intersection, prominent intersection was 4th Avenue and 66th Street in Brooklyn. And here are some more photos. And these are how the slides are identified by the Library of Congress. So it says these are the mates of the Norwegian Merchant Marine on the upper left. These are the gunnery school trainees at Travers Island in the center. To the far right is shipmasters of the Norwegian Merchant Marine. And the bottom left photo are representatives from the Norwegian Seamen's Union. So World War II united local Norwegian churches and secular organizations to put on a joint 17th of May parade. Because previously the two organizations would put on separate parades. And so I guess they wanted to show their support for the compatriots in German-occupied Norway by co-hosting a joint parade. And so I think this was one of the highlights of the parade because there are several slides of this. And this is how the slide is described. This small 22-foot boat in which Norwegian boys escaped from Norway over the North Sea to join the Royal Norwegian Air Force in England and Canada. So we've heard of the Shetland bus and all that. And here it seems like there was a group of young Norwegians that actually rowed across the North Sea to get to England. And again, a close examination of the sign, it reads, in the wake of Leif Erikson, modern Vikings rowed 300 miles across North Sea to join fighting forces. This is the smallest boat that ever crossed from Norway to British Isles. So it shows the dedication and sacrifice of all those who wanted to fight for the Allied cause on the Norwegian side, but there came at a high price. So I have developed this chart here that shows the number of ships and the number of seamen that were lost by year. So you see the first two bars represent the phony war years, in which there was no distinction between the home fleet and the international fleet. But then you see after the German invasion of Norway April 9th, 1940, you see that disparities start to grow, and it reaches a climax in 1942. And then it starts to decline. And actually the losses to the to the home fleet start increasing a little bit. So in honor of this sacrifice, there's been several monuments or memorials erected over the years. So I included some pictures where you see me and my children, so you get a little bit of the size of the sculpture. So this was on a lovely day in Oslo. But, and it was kind of strange because while I was there, there was a tour group of Germans were being told about what the significance of the monument meant. So I thought that was interesting. But anyway, the plaque reads, it's in Norwegian, but it says in World War II, over 1,000 Norwegian ships from the Merchant Marine and Navy carried out countless military missions unloading 145 million tons of cargo of invaluable importance for the Allied victory. The merchant ships were armed and more than half were lost, and hardships left traces on most of the 35,000 war sailors. 4,500 died in the fight for Norway's liberation. Our sailors' courage and loyalty will always be remembered with deep respect and gratitude. There's a Seamen's monument in Bergen. As you can see, the weather changed by the time we got to Bergen. But anyway, that's another story. But this is in the town square. It's 23 foot tall, and each side of this monument represents a different era in Norwegian sailing. So the photo here is on the 20th century war sailors. So what the main image here is, if you can see it, is a male figure kind of lost in the sea there. And he's being greeted by an angel below to guide all of them eventually to heaven. And then there's another big Seamen's Memorial Hall in Stavanger, Norway. This was initially dedicated to commemorate sailors who died during World War I, but it was expanded in 1952 to honor those who died in both world wars. So inside the crypt, the names of all about 8,000 Norwegian and foreign deceased seafarers are engraved into copper plates. So in 2015, the names of those who died in the home fleet were added. And in 2017, the names of the foreigners who served in the Norwegian merchant fleet were added. But in North America, there are several monuments as well in Lunde, Nova Scotia. Again, there's a monument right where the entrance to Camp Norway was, plus an identical monument almost in kind of the town square. And the verbiage on the memorial says it commemorates all the Norwegians who assembled in Lunenburg after the invasion of Norway and trained at Camp Norway for the service and the liberation of their homeland. It's both in Norwegian and English. So there are two similar memorials in Chester and Liverpool, Nova Scotia, that commemorates the hospitality the Norwegian seamen received in these two cities during World War II. There's another memorial in Halifax in the harbor. And so the inscription reads, in memory of the Norwegian Merchant Navy, Royal Norwegian Navy, and Royal Norwegian Army who were lost at sea or were buried in Nova Scotia during the Second World War. We will remember them. So on the reverse of the monument are the names of 30 Norwegians who are buried in one of the 4 cemeteries in Nova Scotia. There's also a monument in Saranac Lake, New York. So during World War II, hundreds of Norwegian seamen were sent to cure cottages and surrounding sanitariums around Saranac Lake in the Adirondacks for treatment after contracting tuberculosis. So there are 15 men and 1 female, a captain's daughter, who died of tuberculosis and are buried in this at Pine Ridge Cemetery. And so the marker reads, in memory of the Norwegian seamen who died in the struggle to free their homeland, 1940 to 1945. And the graves and the monument are maintained every year by the Norwegian government. And then one that's more closer to home for me is the Norwegian Veterans Monument in Battery Park in Lower Manhattan, New York City. This one was dedicated in 1982, and I'll just read the main inscription here. In World War II, 1,100 Norwegian ships served the Allied cause by hauling supplies between US ports and war theaters abroad. A sizable part of the Allied force was supplied by ships flying the Norwegian flag. More than 30,000 sailors and naval gunners manned the ships. Many of them looked to New York, the principal port of call, as their home port during the war. The losses were heavy, 570 ships and 4,000 sailors. So my father played a small part in the rededication ceremony of this monument. It was originally dedicated in 1982, but it was moved in 2005. So on the left, you see my father getting ready to lay the wreath with his friend Carl Andreessen. There in the center, you see King Harold paying his respects at the wreath that was just laid by my father and Mr. Andreessen. And then on the far right is my dad and Carl and a few other gentlemen are talking with the king after the ceremony is over. So these are two of the medals that my father received well after the war. So he got a defense medal, which on the back says participant in the struggle. And then the one that he's also very proud of was a war medal that was finally awarded to all the merchant sailors. And so they had a special ceremony in January of 1981 for those in the New York City metropolitan area to get their award. And the medal is on the far left, and the recognition letter is on the right. And there's my dad in the center, and on the far right is Consul General George Stethrop.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
And finally, I just some quotes about the contribution of the Norwegian merchant marines to the Allied victory. So there's a quote from a British cabinet member, Philip Noel Baker, who basically said without the Norwegian merchant fleet, Britain and the Allies would have lost the war because they delivered the high octane aviation fuel that kept their airplanes in the air. A British admiral said, if it were not for the Norwegian merchant marines, we might as well ask Hitler for his term. And Winston Churchill is allegedly to have said, Nortrip ship is like having an additional 1 million combat troops.
Okay. So thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for the presentation. We'll have questions later. I want to go over to John. Are you ready to talk to us? And could you stop the share screen there? And John, you're up. John, we can't hear you. Are you?
How's that? Any better?
Yeah, that's better.
Good. Forgive me, I'm learning a new computer here.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, just a little recap from the last time. We'll be talking a lot about my father tonight, Captain Birger Lunde. He was a mate radio operator during the war, sunk 3 times by 1943. He survived 3 really violent ship losses. The MS Taranger, the Blink, and the Oregon Express. And tonight we'll talk a bit more detail about the Taranger and the Blink. And actually he'll be speaking in his own words, if I got the technology right. There's some videotapes that hopefully will work tonight. He left 2 other ships that were sunk. He was in a lot of other close calls and actions. And then he was wounded when the Oregon Express was sunk. And while he was healing, he worked at Nortress ship and ran what was called the dead letter office. So he was closing out accounts for sailors. And the time was extremely depressing for him. And he was stunned by the losses. Became an American ship captain after the war. He participated in the Korean War. His health began to suffer. He had great trouble sleeping. As a boy, I can remember some of his nightmares. He suffered a massive heart attack in 1971 and spent like 3 weeks in a intensive care in a hospital in Staten Island, and then another 3 weeks regular care before he could go home. And after that, he began to think about his war in a little bit more clarity, but he also applied for a pension. And this was denied from the Norwegians. So he appeals and he's denied again. And he appeals finally to a higher court. And after a lengthy wait, he wins the pension. And now he really had his mind sort of around the pension law and the system. And he started to help others. And by the time he passes away, he's done over 600 cases. And a lot of them ran into lengthy appeals, particularly ones involving widows and that type of application. But he was president of the New York chapter of Norwegian war sailors for many, many years. And while fighting for their rights and fighting for himself, his health came back. And I think it was no by accident, but helping the others was a turning point for him. That's my dad in the middle, my mother on the left. My mother was a very great help in their veterans work. She was highly organized. She'd been an executive secretary for Nortress ship during the war, so knew a lot about this stuff. But she was just a good organizer and a great person to sort of balance him. On the far right is Mrs. Hestog. Her husband was one of the consul generals in New York, and this is during the war and afterwards, and he was one of the few who were seen as very friendly to sailors and the merchant marine. And so they always had Mrs. Hestog. This is actually one of their 17th of May parties. And on the far left is somebody from the Seamen's Church, and his name escapes me, but the Seamen's Church played a very, very involved and helpful role with the families and the sailors, both during the war and afterwards. The early years were difficult for the sailors, and it wasn't until, let's say, the 70s that things began to sort of slowly turn around and recognition for their service came. And I think Bjorn Torre will talk a little bit about his work tonight, and he's really looked at this in depth and is a very good historian, and we're really glad to have him on the team tonight. But as Phil was talking about, his father was involved in the dedication of the stone. A couple times the stone got moved by New York mayors. The last one was Bloomberg, who wanted to turn Battery Park into a small farm. And because he had a theory that New York could feed itself. But at any rate, the rock's been moved around a lot, and thank goodness each time we've had sort of rededication ceremonies. I want to talk a little bit about some of the other people in the club. There were several women who had been radio operators in the war, and I think there was a significant number of them. The picture here is somewhat covered up. That's Gunnery, all right? On the right, you can't see her because of the way this thing is set up. But her husband, Willie Berg, he was kind of interesting. He had been torpedoed in the First World War. torpedoed again in the Second World War. And then as a carpenter on an American ship, he was shot by a sniper in Saigon in 1965. So he was really one of those guys who was just a survivor. He'd been an Olympic boxer, a vaudevillian, and a protege to Mae West at one time. So there's a lot of interesting people in the club. And I think Gunnery had to keep a little bit of an eye on Willie, as I remember. All right. Also, about 10% of the members were part of the 99th Infantry Battalion. And I think this group in itself could easily be a session to talk about. This is a very unusual group, not a lot known about them. But my father-in-law was one of them, and I'll talk about that in a minute. They were a Norwegian-speaking battalion, basically, in the US Army. And there was an awful lot of sailors who, through different ways, ended up in the service. The first couple of years they spent in Rocky, learning, and they were one of the first US Army ski troops. And my father-in-law, who was there, loved that type of work, but they would pay a price. He loved the camping, he loved the skiing, but they were in the D-Day, Battle of the Bulge. They had 100 days on the line. He died. He won a Bronze Star and went to his grave not telling us what he did. But at the end of the war, they were brought to Norway. He returned to the same harbor he had left with the whaling fleet, and rushed into town. So he actually got to sort of liberate his own hometown as a U.S. Army, Norwegian-speaking member of the U.S. Army. This is part of their history book, and it's kind of interesting. Here's a U.S. Army history book printed in Norway. I always thought this kind of fascinating. So tonight, this is my father-in-law's picture. He's at the top row, second from the left. And like I say, he won a Bronze Star. We don't know what for. Now, the interesting thing about this group of soldiers, and I guess it was about 1,000 total, they made a very Nordic decision up front, which was to really limit medals. In fact, they were kind of against it. They didn't want anyone doing his special, but and I think he could never really talk about his medal for that reason. But now I'm going to sort of change gears a little bit and begin talking about my father again. What I've got is some footage from the BBC documentary Forgotten Heroes, which was released in 1993. 1943 had been viewed as a critical year in the Battle of the Atlantic. So this was to commemorate the 50th anniversary. It was one of the first times people began to talk about the role of the Merchant Marine in a positive kind of way. And they went on in this 1 hour film. It highlights the personal losses and experiences of merchant seamen, and the sort of odd thing that they're not considered a military personnel, yet they're in the fight. It also notes for the first time, now this is interesting, when they were preparing the film, there was a fellow, Charlie Smith, who was a historian working for the BBC. He came to New York to interview some of the veterans, and he told me that as they got into this, they were overwhelmed with the Norwegian contribution. It had sort of slipped through all the cracks. And the Norwegians in particular had, the Germans had offered a tremendous sums of money to the captains to bring the ships home, but they didn't. And so it was kind of a really long overdue moment of recognition. The producer of the film, Tom Roberts, who was actually an American, his father had been in the Merchant Marine, and this had been kind of on his bucket list to get something done. His father had passed away, but he wanted to do something like this, and he did a great job. They chartered the Liberty ship, John W. Brown, located in Baltimore. The interviews were conducted on the bridge of the vessel, and the idea was to sort of put the people back in time. They wanted to be reliving in front of the camera as much as possible. My father spent a whole day there interviewing, and he was proud to participate, but he was seriously exhausted when it was done. I'm going to show some clips right now on the sinkings of the MS Taranger and the Blink. Hopefully it'll work. I did purchase, my son-in-law, who's a lawyer, and maybe he's on tonight, I don't know. He wants me to point out that this video was purchased from the BBC and it's being used here for non-profit educational purposes. So I hope everybody notes that. All right. I edited this right now, so there are some technical limits here, folks. This is from the London Times when the show first came out. It was extremely well received. That's a picture of my dad there. He was pretty photogenic, and he actually had a major part to tell in the documentary. And I want to say here, the sailors actually knew they were combatants in the war. Let's see if this will work now.
Alle tar opp kampen, forsøker å ta opp kampen mot tyskerne. Vi skal jo selv at vi gjør det best med å fortsette i båtene våre og bringe forsyninger til de krigsførende land, som da så å si var det eneste var England.
In 1941, the Americans entered the war. Despite sailing newer and better equipped vessels, they too suffered a greater percentage of merchant navy casualties than any of the American military forces.
We'll talk a little bit about the Taranger now, which will be part of the next clip. Was everybody able to hear that okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. Sorry for the roughness, folks. But hopefully it'll work, the rest of it here. The Taranger my father used to say she was somewhat of a charmed ship. She had made several transatlantic crossings during the early part of the war. And she'd actually been in Cherbourg when the French surrendered. And my father said it was chaos, and the soldiers were dropping weapons in front of the ship, and it was just a terrible time. But they had to stay there waiting for the Norwegian embassy staff to help evacuate them. And they got out, but several ships were dive bombed in the harbor while they were waiting. And as they came out, there were a number of U-boats on the surface, but they let them pass. After they escaped, they were told to go to Casablanca. So they went there, and they were temporarily interred, and they looked like they might have to spend the war there, but their ship's broker ashore worked a major bribe, and they got out. And as Bill was telling me earlier, odd to believe he could bribe somebody in Casablanca, but they were supposed to call it Martinique, but they never did. The ship was actually in dry dock during a 14-day blitz in Liverpool and was never hit. But on one voyage, it caught up with them. And this comes from U-Boat Net, which you can get a lot of detail on the sinkings of the ships. They were chased by U-Boat U-95. They were attacked at night after midnight. And what's interesting here is 16 of the shells, of the 21 shells fired, hit the vessel. My father said it was pretty rough. They were being shot about, and you're going to hear him talking about it in a minute. He had to send out the radio message and then man up the port lifeboat. As he's waiting for the captain and actually the chief engineer, a shell hit the bridge and the captain's head was actually blown off. And then the chief engineer dove into the sea, but he was badly wounded. Then they began to sail toward Iceland, but they were picked up by a British destroyer, the Wolverine, which fortunately had a doctor.
Før jeg kom på vakt, så jeg var jo på det, men der var kulene fløy rundt og alt mulig forferdelig skytning og alt mulig. Om natten så du kulene kom imot deg. Like men følger storstikken, og de kom, du kunne følge kulene kom imot deg. Det var lysende kuler, kan jeg si. Endelig fikk vi da klar skuddsiden. Men det fremdeles kulene sang rundt oss. Og vi rådde klar. Og det var jo bekmørkt, og da kom sømmeren rett imot oss. vi trodde han skulle renne oss ned. Så jeg var jo i kommandoen. Jeg sa ro, så vi kom med klar ubåten. Men han holdt på, endelig så svingte, kom vi klaren. Men jeg trodde at han hadde med vilje tenkt å senke oss, men det var de sterke karene som holdt, som bare kom til klaren. Contrary.
Now, the Norwegian here is, for anyone who's a linguist here, it's a little dated, all right? But the BBC insisted he speak in the language, his primary language at the time of the conflict. So they're trying to get him to relive it. But as you can see, sometimes a little bit of English will slip in here. He often spoke about that evening as a horrific evening, all right? It doesn't go, the BBC did get a lot more, but they had to sort of compact this down, edit it down. But they had an engine on this lifeboat, but it became swamped and it wouldn't start. And then the drag of the propeller slowed them up, so they couldn't keep up with the other lifeboat that came from the ship. So they got separated, but they eventually were, they entered a convoy they had elected not to join earlier. And that's where they were picked up. In the lifeboat was a wounded, actually it was an Englishman, an English sailor. And my father had to operate on his foot that night with a big sheath knife that they used a candle to sterilize. And then later, the guy was, the sailor was on the BBC, and he said the Norwegian mate had done a very proper job of it. So my father was always proud of that. Now I want to talk about the Blink, which is the second ship here, and I guess I'm compressing a lot here tonight. The Blink is one of Norwegian's worst disasters, and I think maybe Bjorn Torre will mention some of this when he talks. She gets torpedoed off of Cape Hatteras, 2 a.m. in the middle of a February gale. I mean, it doesn't get much worse. The submarine had actually chased them for most of the day. They didn't know it though because of the storm, and at night it caught up. It fired 2 torpedoes. One went through the ship because it was a tanker. The second one blew it up, and it blew up the bigger lifeboat that they had. So 23 men had to get into a very small lifeboat. And in the end of several days, only 6 would be alive. My father wrote a final log of this. I think I mentioned it the last time. That's still used by historians today. So he took the time to overhaul all the equipment. But when they rolled over in this really bad sea conditions, and they got it upright, but they couldn't get the water out. And they actually rolled it over several times, but they finally decided just to sit in the lifeboat, and the lifeboat would be floating on some air flotation tanks. But unfortunately, the emergency gear is below the sea surface. The openings to the air tanks contain the emergency gear. So it's pretty bad right now. This is, they get, the first day goes by and somebody toward the evening talks about catching a subway to go someplace. And then an hour later, he's dead. So this situation between the gale, the cold, and the lack of fresh water, it begins to take a terrible toll.
Så satt vi där då och hållit oss fast. Vi hade mått ju hållit oss fast för att båten slängde sig av köret över och den kalla Norwegian blåste fel. Jag sitter där och ser på det och ena efter den andra dör. Och vi tror nog kanske det också ska hända till dig. Och vad jag tänkte på var det hemma. Och jag var rädd för att jag skulle mista förstånd själv. Till och med en man som ville klä av sig och spåra för en reaktion. Sen det var styrman så tog han också att han var vant med att vi gav det en reaktion mot seglen och så. Han klädde av sig och hade satt sig i sjön. Och så skalv det och röstade det. Och så vi alltid på det och det så döde till och med kapten i båten döde. Och det såg så trist ut. En efter en. Det var 17 man i allt. På samma måte mellan en timmes mellanrum.
Jag fick en...
Yeah, it doesn't get much worse than the situation they're in. And the fact that the lifeboat is flooded and they're slowly, their colleagues are dying. And the sharks begin to discover the trail of dead bodies. And they try to get into the vessel, right, into the little lifeboat. And it's the devil of the time to keep them out. But one thing my father stressed most of his life was this power of hope, the inner peace that you can somehow summon, the strength. And I think if you've ever, the Norwegian Lutheran Church in particular will stress this sometimes, this particularly in the hymns and stuff, that the stress the power of hope. And he's going to relate that in the next slide. It's pretty powerful, the way he describes the situation, but it's about as bad as it can get. There's 17 men are slowly perishing. The sharks are chasing them. But my father had this lifelong belief in the power of mind and hope. He was always looking to try to keep his own morale up and that of others. He's going to share now his personal struggles in rescue.
Så hålla mod uppe och ikke ge upp. Man ikke ge upp i det hele tatt, for ikke ge fire en tomme. Du må holde motet ved like, og det klarte jeg til slutt. Og det var det som hjalp meg, for det som mistet motet, det også bukket under og døde. Det var et øyeblikk hvor jeg somlet av og lukket øynene. Og da kunne jeg også se krigsskip i horisonten og alt mulig. Det var hallusjoner. Jo, det var og her står krigsskip og alle ting. Helt flott. Og krigsskip var klar til å pikke oss opp og alt mulig. Men det var jo hallusjoner, så jeg kom til igjen. Og så forstod jeg at her måtte jeg kunne sovne av igjen, for da var det ferdig med det. Slik gikk det døgn etter døgn.
Yeah, I mean, he still has one more sinking in his future, but this one taxed him to his limit, and then some. He came home at this time, home was very far away, but he went to stay with a family in Brooklyn to slowly get his health back and strength back afterwards. But he had to go back to sea because he'd lost all of his belongings and he had to earn a living. So it's an interesting situation, but he had this fundamental belief that in your mind and in your inner strength. I thought maybe we might stop it here. I don't know how you guys feel, but I think this sort of captures the essence of the struggle that these men went through.
Mhm. I think it's a good break point. And I also like to get Bjorn a chance to talk too, since he stayed up late and he's our first speaker from Norway. So Bjorn, and then we'll have questions after Bjorn and Jorgen's talk. So Bjorn, can you go ahead?
Yes, thank you, and thank you for two excellent and moving presentations. I will start sharing my screen as well. If I are now able to see war sailors, the wartime seafarers in World War II.
Yeah, do you see the green button on your screen that says share screen?
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah, you have to click that first.
Yeah.
And then good, we're good.
Oh,
I can see that. Wartime seafarers in World War II, yes.
Yeah, fine. Well, war sailors, for those of you who speak or understand Norwegian, it's krigsseiler in Norwegian. And war sailor is, I assume that is the notion that you who maybe have some relations to the war sailors use, but I don't think it's a very common English term, but I'll come back to that. I will try to present some of the, very briefly, the history of the war sailors. Now we have had Phil's excellent presentation of Nortaship and the importance of the Norwegian merchant marine, and we had John's moving story of his father. So I will try to not repeat much, because it's so much to talk about when you talk about the war sailors' history. But first, 2 words about where I work. Here you see 2 photos. The first one in black and white is from, it's the same building, both photos. The black and white one is from before the Second World War, but the reason why I have a photo is because it was used by the Gestapo from 1942 to 45 as a headquarters and a center for interrogation and torture. And it was all the horror there made people in our region create a peace and human rights center from 2001, and this year we will mark 20 years of our work with using bad history to try to create a better world, just in brief. So we educate young people about what happened during the war, about human rights, use of torture, but we also try to have programs to prevent radicalization and extremism. And of course, we have a Center for the History of Seafarers' War, which I am the academic leader of. In Norwegian, it's Norsk Senter for Krigsseilerhistorie. And our work is both researching the history, but also try to document it and disseminate our findings. And we have several websites. I will show one of those afterwards. And we also share a lot of our stories on Facebook and Instagram. Just search for Krigsseilerne. I am in charge of the research. In particular, I finished my PhD thesis in 2017 at University of Agder in Kristiansand. And the title is Seafarers or War Sailors, and you see the long title there. I was analyzing how the seamen was mobilized in the Second World War to Norwegian merchant fleet. As Phil said, it was quite difficult to get enough seafarers, so quite hard measures were used. And one of my findings was that Norway cooperated quite closely with British and American authorities to try to find those seamen who didn't want to sail. In America, for example, a cooperation with the immigration authorities, especially from 1942, where Norwegian seafarers and other Allied seafarers who didn't want to sail were taken to Ellis Island and deported to Europe. So that was one of my findings. My title, Seafarers or War Sailors, is regarding the character of sailing on a merchant ship during the Second World War, because you're neither a civilian or a military, you're something in between. And my conclusion was that this position between normality and war and civilian and military, that made a influence very strongly on how the seafarers were mobilized. And I also think that it influenced how their post-war history also became so difficult. I'll come back to that. Phil had some excellent words about the establishment of Norwegian, so I will not go into that, but I would like to just show you this picture, or this poster that Norwegian government in exile made in 1941, I believe. It's supposed to show how the Norwegian fleet, the fourth largest in the world, where all the ships were situated on 9th of April 1940, when Germany invaded Norway. So you will understand how few Norwegian ships that were close to Norway, and how big the job was to try to include all of them into the biggest shipping company in the world, Norwegian. I think this picture also then make it easier to understand how this could be the far most important Norwegian contribution to the Allied victory in the Second World War. So I normally use this in every presentation I use because I like it very much. Phil, I think you showed all of these quotes that I have shown here. The first one is quite interesting, that the Norwegian fleet is worth more than 1 million soldiers, because the first one to publish that was a British journal. And this quote was quite popular, and the US Admiral for the merchant fleet, Emery Land, also used it. I haven't found any examples of Churchill said that, but I know that a lot of people say so, but I haven't managed to identify evidence on that. But there were several people using this quote, and the Norwegian government loved it when this quote was made. But I think it's obvious that the Norwegian merchant fleet was quite important for the Allied cause, especially before the US entered the war, during the Battle of Britain in particular, where almost 50% of the oil was brought on Norwegian tankers. I just go back to this picture. Just imagine on this ship there were crews that suddenly were cut off from going home to Norway. And for me, working with this history, it's been quite important for me to try to have focus on the seamen in particular, and the women, of course, but all those working on the ship and how their story is during the war, because there were about 30,000 Norwegians working on the Nutra ship. In addition to that, it was almost as many foreigners also. And all of them, they had their own way of experiencing the war. And I think all of them have a history to be documented, a history to be told. And of course, in a very short presentation, I cannot enter so many of them, but I would like to just bring up one story, and it's the story about the ship Borgestad, which in 1941 was leading a convoy. This was an armed merchant ship, and it was leading a convoy where in the south of the Atlantic, when the convoy was attacked by the German warship Admiral Hipper, a light cruiser. And the Hipper, it was far, far bigger than Borgestad, but nevertheless, the captain of Borgestad, Lars Krotnes, which you see the picture of, he decided to just steer straight ahead to the great German warship and start shooting. Why did he do that? Well, it was to try to give the other ships in the convoy a chance to get away. And what happened was naturally that Borgestad was totally destroyed by the German ship. Everybody on board Borgestad died, but it's quite clear that the sacrifice of Borgestad helped far more ships in the convoy to get away from the German ships than if Borgestad also had just tried to get away. So this is just one very moving history of all those ships that went down during the war. And inside this ship, it was also a lot of individual stories. And you see the photo of Norma Hayes Nergård. Norma Hayes was American, and apparently someone has told me that she was the first American woman to die in battle as in service of the Allies during the war. I'm not sure if that's true, but she was American. She was serving on a Norwegian ship. She had just got married to a Norwegian seaman on board, which they sailed together, just got married. And this is also a part of this war sailor history, which I think need to be told. John told us about, it's hard to describe the words of the shipwreck of Blink, because the stories of every sailor who went down one by one is so hard to understand. But it needs to be said that nevertheless, on Norwegian ships, the chances of survival became better and better in course of the war. As many as 50% of the Norwegian seamen, they experienced that their ship were being sunk. But as many as 79% of the crews survived when their ship was sunk. And I think that's quite impressive. It's due to different causes, but if you see the photo of the life-saving suit there, you see one of the main reasons. And this was life-saving suit that Norwegian authorities, Nutra ship, tried to buy to every seaman in the fleet from 1941-42. But it took some time before everybody received such a life-saving suit. But that made seamen keep dry and warm if they had to swim in the cold Atlantic. Well, that was very briefly, extremely briefly, about some of the struggles and stories from the war. But I think one of those things that really define the history of the war sailors is the peacetime. In fact, during the war, I have not found any examples that the seamen called themselves war sailors. It was rather after the war, when they started organizing themselves, that they start to use the word krigsseiler or war sailor. And try to understand how the peacetime was. I think it's important to know that when the peace came to Norway in 7th and 8th of May 1945, as you see on the photo on the left in Kristiansand, they were celebrating. But of course, on the ships, they could celebrate, but they were still thousands of miles away from home, and they couldn't go home for a long time, at least for a lot of seamen. Some even didn't come home before 1947, and some didn't even go home at all. You see a photo on the right-hand side there. It's from outside Sandefjord, where a whaling ship is sailing in the fjord, and the family of a whaler is waiting for their father or grandfather to return home. And when they returned home in 45, 46, 47, it wasn't any, I think the great celebrations was over in Norway, and people wanted to get back to normal. And then the seamen didn't get the real notion of being celebrated or acknowledged or recognized. And that brings me to the difficulties, and which very briefly is, I think it's the problem that the seamen didn't get the recognition they should have received. And also they didn't get the understanding of what they have done, and also of the hardship they had gone through, and the hardship they went through also in peace. Because a lot of people had already had health problems when they arrived in Norway. And then after some years, a lot of seamen also developed traumas. As we know now much more about war traumas than the society knew then. And this also created a distance to the seamen, where the society they always saw seamen drinking and being aggressive, but didn't understand why. And this also made it difficult to try to get the seamen to be a part of Norwegian society in a way. So therefore, I think it's terrible to read about and learn about this long struggle for war pension rights for Norwegian seamen. It's very nice to hear that John's father helped a lot of seamen and their families to get pensions. And in 1968, important law was came to Norway and was passed the Storting, and that made it far easier to receive a war pension for those who had sailed in the war. And a second thing that I think most of all created the feeling that the society in Norway didn't recognize or understood the Norwegian seamen, was the fight for the secret fundamental ship. Phil, he told us about how this was established, and that the seamen, they lost politically in Stortinget in 1948. They tried to raise their cause in the Supreme Court, but lost there in 1954. But then again, they won a victory in 1972, where all those who had sailed in neutral ship received an ex gratia payment. And I think in the 1960s and 1970s, there was a sort of boost for the war sailors. They suddenly started to feel more recognition, and people started to know more about what they had gone through. And that was the first wave, in a way, which made a lot of seafarers feel better in the society. But then after the 1970s, I think the society more or less forgot about the Norwegian seafarers and the war sailors. But then again, a new and even bigger wave, if I can call it a wave, came the next and the last 10 or 15 years. And therefore I call it the new war heroes. Possibly the most important factor here was Jon Michelet, the writer, who wrote a series of novels, 6 novels, about a war sailor, which reached very far in Norwegian society. I think that was important, that, and also led to the Norwegian government's apology in 2013 for how the Norwegian society had treated the Norwegian war sailors. And as a sign of how the society has started to recognize them, the war sailors were voted as the most important Norwegian since 1814 in the Norwegian newspaper VG, the largest newspaper. And you see a photo of the ship there. It's the War Sailor Museum, Hestmannen, which also is in my town, Kristiansand. And new memorials and monuments started to arrive, in a way, in Norwegian cities from 2010 or so. And it's coming up new memorials the next years also. And that's a sign of the Norwegian society really recognizing the effort of the war sailors. And I think it's quite important that new movies are coming. Right now, 2 movies are in the making of Norwegian war sailors. I am quite closely connected to one of them, and I think it will be a good film too, so hopefully it will also reach American cinemas too. It's a part of the process when the Norwegian war sailors have been recognized. It's interesting to see also that the definition of who is a war sailor has been expanded in a way. So we have got new or unknown groups of war sailors, which like the seafarers from World War I, where about 2,000 Norwegians were killed. They are also now seen as a war sailor. And the seafarers who sailed in occupied Norway in the home fleet is also now recognized as war sailors. The same with those who sailed in the Norwegian Navy is now regarded as war sailors. My work with trying to explore the foreign seafarers' history has also led to the foreign seafarers being included in this term. And you see a photo here of a Canadian telegraph operator, Barbara Briggs, who also she was one of the many female seafarers, both foreign and Norwegian, who I think their story is also coming now and being told more than ever before. In last, I would like to share and show the websites which we are working with. This is on Norwegian, it's called Krigsseilerregisteret. It's when I translate it to English, it's War Sailor Register. It's an online database, which our goal is to try to document the history of all the seafarers in Norwegian merchant fleet and in the Navy and in the home fleet, including the foreigners. We also try to document the history of Norwegian seafarers sailing on foreign ships, like American ships, for instance. So it's quite a big job. We have managed to document 67,000 seafarers now, but we are not finished yet. We are more or less finished with those who served in the merchant fleet abroad in Norwegian, but now we are working on the Norwegian Navy. Then I can show you here. Here you can see the website, and if I then click on seafarers, I can type Birger Lunde, the name of John's father. And here we see his name, click on his name. And then we see the page of Birger Lunde. All seamen have such a page, but it's not every seaman has. We don't have so much information on every seaman as we have on Birger Lunde. And here I found a photo of him, which I have put in here. And if you click on engagements, we can see what ships he sailed on and when during the war. And you can click on different ships to learn more about those ships as well. And possibly the most interesting things to read for a lot of people is here, the maritime inquiries, where we have published the actual sources on the inquiries that were done after a shipwreck. So on Blink, for example, which we heard about now, this is written in Norwegian here, but very often it's in English instead, so it's possible for those of you who don't read Norwegian to understand. And here is Birger Lunde as one of the witnesses to what happened. So a lot of family members really like to see and read those reports, because very often it's the only voice they have from their father or grandfather of what really happened. So I will just give you just a hint of what you can find here, and we are not finished. We will just continue our work with this page. And also like Per Eskeland, also that's here we see that Eskeland, father of Phil, we don't have a photo of him yet. We can see here his medal, which is here like Phil told us. He received the war medal here, but also the medal of participation during the war here. So that is also a kind of information we disseminate. Yeah, that is very brief about this page, but you can just discover for yourself. Yeah. then I think I will try to have used more or less everything on my time now. I just say thank you, and I put up here my email and the website address, and I will very much like to receive some questions as well.
Okay, great. Very good talk. Very good talks. 3 talks. Jorgen, is it okay if we postpone your talk to a later meeting? Jorgen? Anyway,
Sorry, I didn't unmute. No, absolutely. I think it's been very interesting, and it's getting late for everybody. So
so let's just have some questions on that. I like the way the 3 talks work together, and Bjorn, very good talk. Thank you for staying up late, and it's interesting how it ties in with some of the points is how the Norwegian sailors were treated. Now, one thing that came up that I found was interesting, and I make sure I understood it correctly, that during the war, that if a sailor would spend a week in a lifeboat, that time would be considered vacation. Did I understand that correctly?
No, I didn't say anything about that.
Not you, but some of the, I think it was Phil or John. Am I quoting you correctly?
Well, my father always told me that was the case. The interesting thing there was if there's a book called 1,000 Norwegian Ships, and the sinking of the Blink is in it, and the interviews are taking place, and the survivors are talking about a ski trip that they want to make. And my father's contention was that's because they already had been docked holiday, so they wanted to go on a holiday. But so he claimed, yeah, that they would basically it took away from your annual leave. So
worst vacation ever. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Could I just bring in one perspective on that? Because on the start of the war, the rules were quite harsh because the salaries stopped when the ship was sunk. But when in course of the war, it got quite better for the seamen who went through a shipwreck, and in 42, 43, then it was 6 to 8 weeks off after a shipwreck with pay. So it got better, but in the first month of the war, it was quite horrific rules.
Yeah, and another thing I was interested in was the role of women in the Merchant Marine, and I think both John and Phil mentioned that, and you were mentioning that. Women were they particularly like radio operators, or what sort of role would they have on the Merchant Marine ship?
I think it's 2 different roles mainly, because at the start of the war, most Norwegian female worked at sea. They were working with as a mess girl or a stewardess, but as during the war, several Canadian women in particular, but also from America and Iceland, they educated as radio operators and entered Norwegian ships because American and British ships didn't want female operators on their ships.
Mm-hmm.
And, yeah, there were at least 2. There were at least 2 in the chapter in New York that were introduced to me as radio operators from the club. And I know one friend whose mother was also one. So so I don't know how often they had radio operators that were women, but there certainly were a few who served during the war.
Yeah, and in the register we have so far, we have 348 women in Nortra ship.
Okay.
348, and the majority from abroad.
Yeah, I knew about the struggles that the merchant marines had being recognized, but I never heard of seamen being deported from the United States. That was kind of a shock.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I never heard of that.
No, I think, well, that is something that was quite new when I published my thesis. And I think that's a story that neither the seamen nor the authorities wanted to talk about. Yeah. So that's one reason why it's not commonly known. But it was enforced to work as a seaman. You couldn't choose not to sail.
Yes.
Yeah, but I think the odds against you on certain runs, I mean, the chances of death were so high. I mean, you can understand the reluctance to go. And I know when my father was recovering from his wounds, he was working at Nortra ship and handling what they called the dead letter office, which was canceling out their accounts and I guess preparing papers for their families. And long after the war, he was approached by a couple of families looking for bank accounts and stuff. But at the time that had been cashed out mostly in London. So, but the whole thing was a difficult situation, no matter how you look at it, because their incomes were cut and stuff like that. But some of these runs were just so dangerous.
Oh, yeah.
There were a few suicides rather than go out again.
Your dad's account of hanging on to the boat was just, I don't know how people did it, frankly. It's just awful. You know, Alistair MacLean, you know, he wrote spy novels back in the 70s, and he's one of the first ones in a novel that I saw that wrote about the ships, but it was involving some kind of a tower. I haven't read it in years, but that's the first time I encountered anything like people in the convoys, because I don't think that was well known, you know, after the war. You know, I'm a post-war kid, and I didn't know that story.
Well, there was a very strong political struggle in America to get merchant marine recognition as well for the American merchant marine. It wasn't just a Norwegian phenomenon. I think in the history of it, it was a couple of people squared off. There was the head of the Seamen's Union and I think the head of the American Legion were in strong conflict for years. So it was only, I think, after that generation maybe passed away that it moved ahead in Congress. It's like the mid 90s they get their recognition in the U.S.
I wondered, Bjorn, what brought you to this work? The others I heard, their fathers were all involved, which is very interesting. But I didn't hear as to your parents and how you came to have an interest in this area of history.
Well, for me, that's quite a paradox because I'm a historian, but my great-grandfather, I showed a picture of him, but I didn't tell you that it was him. But he sailed both in the First World War and in the start of the Second World War, where he was when he retired. But I don't think I have never seen him as a war sailor until I started working with this topic. But it was quite a coincidence that I started working with this because my archive where I work, they would start this center about the war sailors, and I really was thrilled by the possibility to work as a historian on this topic. So
excellent.
It's
yeah.
Finally. I have to recommend his thesis is really worth reading, by the way. And it's in English, all right? And he's a first-class historian. I can see where he's come at this as he's a real professional historian, and his perspective is on, the thesis also gives you some real insights on how historians think and take problems apart. So it's a great document.
Can someone send the link for that? Because
yeah, I will
write it down.
Make sure that links, and maybe we can publish it in the newsletter if you know
Great.
some of it. Yeah.
Thank you. I was curious about the financing and the business aspect of this. I mean, these maritime companies were owned by companies, I guess, in Norway. And then the Germans came in, and yet, what happened to the money? Who was paying the merchant marine sailors, the war sailors? Who was funding Camp Norway? Who was, how did the money aspect work?
Well, one of the stories I heard was the tankers carried, actually, they overloaded the vessels considerably, right? If you look at a ship, they have what's called a plimsoll line, and it's not supposed to be, it's supposed to come down to that level and not any further. But during the war, they went 25% over that weight. They thought the chances of being destroyed in a storm were much less than being sunk by the submarines, and to get the cargo through was so critical. But that extra cargo, one of the stories I heard was that the fees for that, these are wartime premium cargoes, that value went to fund, and I think Phil had a slide on this, it paid for at least 90% of the government in exile.
Okay.
Which is the big fight at the end, why the sailors didn't get some of us can't sit still when we hear that Nortra Ship Fund thing, because we grew up hearing, my father was owed that money in 1945, and he gets paid in the early 70s, interesting aside, when the BBC documentary finished, and it was extremely well received in England, they called up and said they would offer it for free to honor him to the Norwegian broadcasting system. And my father paused for a minute and he said, "Make the bastards pay." So there was a feeling, the fact that he did 600 cases, and early in this, the consular people, when he started to really win some of these cases, they came after him personally. So he decided, look, they just didn't know what it was like, these old captains. He said, okay, it's personal, then it's between you and me now, and there was an implied threat there. And then the one person who took to run the initial sort of bureaucratic charge against it later became one of the best friends the sailors ever had in New York. So, sometimes I think Norwegian captains in particular, they were business managers. So ships were individual business units. We didn't get a chance to talk about that tonight. But
well, that's part of what I wanted. I was curious about.
They traveled different routes, my father's first 5 years at sea, he was on a ship that went across Europe, down through the Panama Canal, and then up the West Coast, picking up fruit with passengers and then going back. It's interesting because later they had a big ceremony at the Waldorf Astoria in 1995 on the liberation of Norway. And my father was part of the planning committee. He wasn't well, and I was taking him there. And they said to me, "Gee, your father has we can tell you come from really well-to-do people in Norway," which is not the truth at all. And he says, "Your father has such excellent knowledge of wines and table etiquette." And then I realized that's his 3 years as a cabin boy. But they had him as a cabin boy because the ships were segregated. The officers, the passengers were together. And so the steward and the cabin boy would be with them. The rest of the crew was kept in isolation. There was a real pecking order. And so he was surrounded by role models early on. And so almost all those Norwegian captains had started off as cabin boys.
So where was Nortra Ship? Am I saying that right? Was that in England then, or physically? Did it have an office, or was it just a?
My mother worked at it, and it was the main office in Manhattan. I don't know how big it was, but it was a big office. And
they had two main offices, one in London, which had, from what I can gather from reading about this, like 350 or more employees. And then they had an office in Lower Manhattan with about 200 employees at one point. But then they had offices in like 50 other cities around the world too, but they were like little branch offices.
I see. So that kind of protected them from the Nazis or the German. The whole financial operation wasn't in Norway, it was elsewhere.
Yeah,
and I guess that's how they kept in contact with each other. So there would probably be, I don't know, It wouldn't surprise me in every port in South America, had a Nortra ship office, for example. I'm
And a
sure.
Norwegian bar also, I think.
May I also add that I think establishment of Nortra ship was pure genius, because that secured Norwegian flag on Norwegian ships, but also the income from those ships. And it wasn't the alternative wasn't German control, but British control of those ships, like the Danish ships, just like Phil said, because where the ships were 9th of April more or less decided who were to control those ships. And the British managed to get the insurance right. And when the Norwegian government established Nortra ship, they had this ship, the world's largest shipping company, that took the income and could use that money to build up a Norwegian army and navy, but also bring food to Norway and run different things and have a political influence in the among the allied governments as well. So, but like John said, if you mention Nortra ship to war sailors, they will not be happy.
Yeah. Well, my mother worked at the office there, so she was executive secretary to the captain of the port. Now, he had to deal with all sorts of problems as captain of the port, and not the least of which was having a lot of young, healthy men running around Manhattan and Brooklyn, getting into all sorts of mischief, right? So, yeah, we could talk a lot about some of the stories I used to hear, but the Nortra ship folks, I mean, it's sad to remember for that fund and holding that back, because it really was an extremely effective organization, and it was a consortium of competitors. In the normal circumstances, these guys would be fighting for each other over charters and stuff like this, and niches. So, and the way my father would talk about Norwegian ship owners, it was like they were just a step below royalty. I mean, they were highly influential in the politics of the country. I mean, one story I heard was they were part of the fact that Norway shares a border with Russia, right? There was all sorts of talks about, sort of looking the other way. The Russians could come in. The ship owners were people who are saying, you better not let this happen if you want these ships. So, I mean, they were really savvy negotiators. I mean, and had a long history of dealing in the world's harbors and ports, places like Casablanca and things like that, and Brooklyn.
I can add a couple of words to that. During King Haakon's anniversary during the war, the BBC had a special about him, and they made a big deal out of, excuse me, that the Norwegian government was the only exile government that didn't cost the British taxpayers anything. And that was, of course, because of the Nortra ship. And so it was, when you read Norwegian accounts about that, and my dad was in England during the war, that made everybody very proud, of course, but it was thanks to the merchant ships, obviously.
Yeah, and in one of the books, that I was reading, they talked about they were a little upset over the cramped office quarters in London. So then they bought some estate, outside of London, and talked about all the lovely garden parties they would have. The king and others would show up. So it was kind of a second satellite office there attached to London as Nortra ship grew.
Well, Phil, you were talking about the whalers. One of the stories my father told me was they were all staying in this hotel. They had been paid, and they were all in this hotel in Scotland, and they were partying very hearty and making a wreckage of the place, and they were evicted. So they pooled their money, went into town, and bought the hotel.
So, okay, that's one way to handle it.
Whaling was a very lucrative business. I mean, really, there was some real money made in that, and that it was a difficult, dangerous trade, but they were paid well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I mean, this is the book that I'm drawing a lot from with Camp Norway. So I'm going off what they say in here, but one thing was that they finally got paid. They were in Camp Norway, and they had all this extra money around. So all these former whalers were buying cars. So they were driving all up and down in in Nova Scotia, I guess, I don't know, looking for action or for something other than camp life. So then the thing is says, oh, now Camp Norway had a problem where they had to build a parking lot for all these whalers that had cars.
So, and okay, also, we're going to have more stuff on this in the website, norwaydc.org. So I'm going to put that on. Give me a couple of days and I'll be, well, give me at least a day and I'll be putting stuff on that, more material related to this. I think we're past our time, but it's been a great talks and great discussion. Does anyone have some more comments to close up? Jerry?
Just a quick question here. It's great to see everybody, see some folks I haven't seen for a long time, and you're all looking terrific. Terrific presentation tonight. And I have an off-the-wall question. Does anybody know a Paul Gilgee or Gilia from Staten Island, New York? I don't know if he was a tugboat captain.
The name sounds familiar. Yeah.
Okay. And the reason I say that, he's a cousin of mine and he's celebrating his 100th birthday on Thursday. So, and I don't know what his experience was during the war, but I'm going to have to find out because he's of the age that he probably participated. So
I would think so.
But anyway, great to be here.
Okay,
Jerry.
glad you could be there. Yeah.
Yes.
Jerry.
Jerry, can I ask you, is this Paul Gillier, does he have a son, Paul Gillier?
Yes, he does.
I think he is married to my cousin's daughter, Anne Lieberman.
Okay.
Do you
Yeah,
know
Paul.
his wife?
His wife's name is Jessica.
Okay, then maybe it's the grandson because she's married to a Paul Gillier from Staten Island.
Okay.
He's from Brooklyn, like me.
Yeah, yeah.
And the name, I mean, it's not that common.
No, they're all living in Florida now. So
Thank you.
thanks.
Jerry, do you know what tug company he worked for?
No, I used to know and I've forgotten.
My dad worked for Red Star Towing.
Okay, no, it wasn't that one.
Okay.
Yeah. It was one of the big ones, but I can't remember the name right now.
Moran.
It's been a long time.
Yeah.
Somewhat pertinent to this might be the recent movie that just came out, Greyhound. We just saw it recently. It's a fabulous movie, which really shows you what it was like being in a convoy going through U-boat infested waters in World War II. I highly recommend it. It's streaming on Apple. And also, I've really enjoyed Atlantic Crossing, this new masterpiece theater thing about Crown Princess Merta and Franklin Roosevelt in World War II.
Yeah.
So Norway's kind of out there now.
Yes. Next meeting, we'll be talking about the Atlantic Crossing and all the history behind it, but that is fascinating. And Greyhound is a great movie. It's a really intense. It's really like you were, you feel a lot like you were actually there in the battle scene. It was very well done and apparently pretty historically accurate. So,
Bjorn, what were the movies you met? You said there were 2 movies coming out or being made now. Is the Battle of Narvik, is that one of them? I read something about that.
I was not talking about the Battle of Narvik, but that is coming this Christmas. But those 2 films I was talking about is about the merchant fleet, Seamen. Yeah. So I think I have read the manuscript on one and working as a historical consultant, but so I try to make it as correct as possible. So, but I think it's a very good script, and I hope it will be a good movie as well.
Good.
Are there things you noticed in Atlantic Crossing that you would like to correct?
A lot of things.
Well, maybe that's too long a question then.
I think so, but it's a great debate in Norway about Atlantic Crossing. A lot of debates. So, but I think you will have an interesting talk in May about Atlantic Crossing.
Yes.
You should come back.
No, we definitely want Bjorn to come back to our meetings, and we're. What I was interested as to how you mentioned a series of fictional books, historical fiction, changed Norwegian's attitude. It's interesting how a fictional account often is more impactful to people than an actual historical account, because you get a more wider range of emotions. Would you say that might be true?
Yeah, absolutely. And you reach farther, I think, writing fiction, and especially when you write just like Jon Michelet did. He reached so far with his books. So yeah, so it's very fascinating that his books managed to do that, because I don't know. Well, possibly in the 1960s, it was also a fictional book written by Per Hansson. Every 10th had to die. It's also translated to English. But that was based on his interviews with war sailors. I think it woke up a lot of people. But Jon Michelet even more.
Thank you. Any more comments?
Bill, just one suggestion, maybe sometime in the future, maybe we could talk about this 99th Battalion, which I think is a fascinating story of where a lot of the Norwegian sailors ended up. I don't know if you can see it. It's this is you can see them actually, the ski troops, and this is in Camp Hale, Colorado. So in 1942 Act of Congress, they had a Norwegian speaking battalion. These were the first US Army mountain troops, really. They were part of the mountain ranges, but they got to see it was training actually for an invasion of Norway that didn't happen, but they got to see some really horrific fighting. There were 100 days on the line. They were in and out of Germany at the end. They caught off in the Battle of the Bulge, trapped. But they were specialty troops that were brought in, like troubleshooting and stuff. But at the end of the war, they're taken back to Norway. And my father-in-law, he got to actually visit, or basically return to the harbor he'd left with the whaling fleet. So it's kind of an untold story. I think the fact that it was almost totally, well, I'd say maybe a third was Norwegians here in the country, and then it was Norwegian Americans with the other 2/3.
That is definitely going to have a talk on that. And I also want to do more talks on the Merchant Marine in World War II, because I think we really just started to delve into the subjects, and there seems to be a lot of interesting things that we haven't gone into. So that'll be meetings coming up. And of course, I'm open to any suggestions for future meetings, from anything from the Free Viking to the modern age. Any other comments?
Bill,
Yeah,
I want to say something.
Yeah, go ahead. Shoot.
You did a great job, and I'm going to say to all the presenters, Mange takk. My dad said there's no words in Norwegian for please, but there's plenty of words for thank you.
Okay. Mange takk.
Tusen takk.
Okay. And that's
Bill, can I ask a really quick question?
Sure.
Well, first I want to say that the presentations tonight have been absolutely fascinating. On a segment of history that I know nothing about, and it's just really intriguing. And in that vein, I wanted to ask John, I'm sorry if I missed it, but is there a way that we can watch that BBC documentary that you referenced?
Yeah, no, I bought a couple of copies of it. I could probably send one down to Bill. He could circulate it. It was like 1993, it was released, and then they repackaged it with a whole series in the Battle of the Atlantic. So it was like a bonus piece on a BBC package. So I bought 4 or 5 of them. I don't know if they're readily accessible anymore, but I would glad to send one down. My daughter, I think, is a member of the lodge now. Maybe she could drop it off there if you wanted to circulate it.
Sure.
Yeah, that I think that'd be cool if we could watch it sometime.
Yeah, there's parts
Yeah.
I didn't include, which is actually when they're rescued finally from the Blink. And unfortunately, they didn't cover his other sinking, which was the Oregon Express, which was torpedoed in the middle of the Atlantic. And that one, he actually got hurt. And that's kind of how he ends up in Staten Island. My grandfather, who was a retired New York City policeman, brought him home from the hospital to recuperate. And then my mother had already met him at the Nortra ship. So the rest is history, as they say.
Yeah.
So.
So we have a lot more stories to go into. And yeah, if you send it to me, I'll make sure people get a chance to watch it, maybe even have in the post-COVID era, we might actually have a meeting at the lodge where we can have people watch it.
Yeah, I to tell you the truth, some of that stuff I used to use with the younger people, just to kind of the idea that you could, your spirit, your power, the power of hope, is something you could combine with religious training or any other kind of training. That kind of resilience is special.
Yeah, it definitely is. Okay, any other comments? I don't questions or something. Well, again, great presentations. Thank you. We'll keep in touch, and we're going to have the presentation on the Atlantic crossing coming in May 23rd, and we'll hopefully have people from Norway and maybe even people from the cast on it. We'll try and do that. So thank you again, and I wish thank everybody for attending. Thank all the participants, and wish you a good night. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to everybody.
Thank you very
Bye.
much.
Manga talk.
Guess we did okay. Oh, there's Bjorn.
Yeah. Bjorn, Bjorn,
Yeah.
very good talk. Sorry about being up so late, but fascinating. I'm anxious to read your dissertation and so on. I'm fascinated by all sorts of histories, and it's nice to see a disciplined approach to it too, because yeah, good. And but those series of novels have never been that you mentioned about the seafarers, never been translated into English, have they?
I'm not sure, but I can check it out.
Yeah.
Because I know there were plans, but I'm not sure if it really happened.
Yeah, if you could send me the links, that would be great.
Yeah.
Bjorn, years ago, there was an actor contacted my father because there was a play for a while about the Blink. And I think this actor was playing him in it. I never heard any more about it, but it was someplace in Oslo, a theater there, but that was all I remember.
Okay, so Bjorn, and can you send me some of the links? You have my email address.
Yeah, I have.
And then, and then guys, do you have any links, send it to me. I'll make sure that they get up on the website so people can check that out.
Yeah, I mean, if you read history, he is a real professional. I think we're really lucky to have somebody of his thought and skills here tonight.
Definitely. Okay, well, thanks again, and I really appreciate it. So, bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.